Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover World podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, we delve into the life and work of William Morris, the 19th century's most celebrated designer and a key figure in the arts and crafts movement. Renowned antiques dealer and TV personality Drew Pritchard and fashion designer Giles Deacon take us on a journey through the life and work of William Morris. Recorded live at the 2022 Bradford Literature Festival, this episode offers unique insight and perspective on this fascinating historical figure.
I'm Giles Deacon. Very nice to meet everybody. I'm a fashion designer, and Drew Pritchard here.
Yeah, hello, hi, nice to meet you. I think everybody knows what I do.
Do they?
Yes,
Yeah.
a purveyor of sort of old antiques and bits and bobs, or as we nickname it in the antique trades, we sell dead people stuff. Yeah, very glad to be here. Nice to be able to talk about one of my favourite subjects.
Yeah, so we're going to have a kind of an open conversation, I think is probably a good way of putting it, about William Morris.
Yes. Yes.
So, where should we start, Drew?
Well, I suppose there's a time when there was like pre-William Morris for me, and then there was, I was like, who's this guy? You know, at 16 was very, very fortunate to be taken on under a wonderful thing called the YTS. I don't know if any of you remember that, the youth training scheme. And I started, and I was on £14.50 a week. But I started as a stained glass restorer and conservator, and then became a stained glass designer, and then selling it. And on day one, I was put in the van, an old Ford Escort van, and we drove to the far side of Anglesey in North Wales.
The same one that brought us here late.
Yeah. And the building was being pulled down. And my wonderful boss, Gordon, said to me, all of these windows have to come out. And he gave me a 2-minute lesson on how to take a piece of stained glass out. This is something I'd never done in my life before.
Right.
And I was presented with a whole row of William Morris and Morris and Company windows, which I knew nothing about. And something clicked. And I thought, what the hell is this? And it sent a shiver throughout me. And I was just like, I'm looking at these wonderful things.
And what scale were they? What size were these?
They were single transoms, so a single piece. They were about 4 foot tall with a typical Gothic top. Yeah. So they were Morris and Co. and Morris. So
dated
Morris,
from when would these be?
Some of them were late 19th century, and then some of them were as late as 1920 and 30.
Okay.
So that would be Morris and Co. So after his death, but using original designs.
Right.
And I had to then start taking these pieces of glass out.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. And they left me there on my own to do this. And I started taking this glass out, and I was handling it. And the demolition contractor was keeping it all for himself. So I literally took it outside and put it in the back of his Ford Cortina estate. And at the end of the day, he drove off with it all. And I was like, and I didn't really think too much about it. And then a week later, another piece came through. And we were constantly seeing work by this guy. And then there was a piece of glass behind the phone and the fax machine. And I wasn't allowed to touch the fax machine. I wasn't deemed qualified enough to touch the fax machine. And I kept looking at this glass thinking, I really love that piece of glass. I love it. I love it. And Gordon just said, oh, that's Morris. Is it? Really? You know, so I was introduced to him as just a commodity.
Right.
It was just something I worked with.
Yeah.
But I was right next to it all day, every day.
How phenomenal.
Yeah.
And what do you think it was that got the your attraction and your interest so strongly? What was it?
Honestly, it was the sheer beauty.
Yeah. It
was the colour. When you see glass particularly lit correctly, up close, it struck me. I've been very fortunate in my life to be around beautiful things for nearly my whole life. And I was just struck by the beauty and the colour, and it excited me and scared me at the same time, bizarrely. I was a bit like, oh my God, look at this thing. How do I deal with this? And then I decided I better read some books. I'd come out of school with no qualifications whatsoever. In fact, I was thrown out of school. And I was asked to leave, as they said. I thought, well, I need to read about this guy. I need to know about this guy. And I started to read, and I started to see tiny similarities between him and me, and similarities between him and my father, and similarities between the guys who were training me, and it just started to all make sense.
Yeah.
And then one day, years from that, they gave me a piece to restore, and I had to take it apart and redraw a section that was missing, and that's when it really clicked.
Yeah. It's I think it's really interesting the impact that William Morris has had on, I'm sure, everybody here at some point in their lives, and there is a definite kind of, as you say, that sort of sense of pre and post.
Yeah.
For me, it was at school. I was lucky enough to be introduced to a family friend who had an embroidered panel in their house, which was beautiful. It was it had some gold thread on it. It was a little bit decayed, but it was and I was just intrigued by it, from the colours, the technique, and it had this kind of a quality that you sort of slightly medieval quality to it, and it just really drew me in. And I likewise kind of started doing some more intensive research on it, and then sort of left it a bit. And then it was when I started studying at St Martin's that I kind of really got into it a little bit more in depth, and started looking at the practice, the history of all of the different processes. And I was really fascinated by the pear woodcuts for the wallpapers, and that kind of decorative print side of everything. And been lucky enough to do some work with the William Morris Museum up in Walthamstow, and they've been really open and very generous in the access to lots of their archive, which has been really helpful, instrumental, and based the collections upon it, and not as literally as such, but starting points. And there was a collection that we did in 2012 where I kind of liked the idea of Kelmscott being on fire.
Yeah.
And you wake up there in the middle of the night, there's this house fire going on, and you've got to rescue some pieces, and what state they're in. And then they very generously gave access to certain artworks, which we then redrew and used elements of, and developed a whole print and artwork collection off the back of it. So they've been very super to work with in that way.
Well, that goes back to that day when I had to redraw something, and that's when it really clicked with me. So I was redrawing what's called a set of quarries. So it was you'd see that background where he'd overlay the leaves, constantly overlaying, and then he'd stand
like
figures.
Willow and bough type one.
Yes, yeah. And then he'd do it was oak leaves generally on the earlier pieces that were overlaid, and then he'd overlay figures onto them. And there was a piece missing, and I had to draw it, and it just for a brief second I was in his head, because I drew a piece, and then I drew another piece, and then I drew another piece. And I thought, well, that piece is going to go there, and it did.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's, for that split second, I thought, I in his head. And I got to another piece, and he just put a broken line across the center of all of this foliage. And it shocked me, and I thought, man's a genius. That's brilliant.
And that was nothing to do where the repeat would be, was it? Or...
The design repeated underneath that, but what he'd done on something completely flat in the 19th century is give it depth.
Yeah.
And shadow, and it was just brilliant. And then glass choice and everything else.
But I think the boldness is quite extraordinary, isn't it? Because it must have been incredibly new in lots of ways to people see that kind of grand scale of artwork, of it being very drawn. Because I guess what had been historically the kind of wallpapers.
Well, they've done wallpapers.
Before.
His tapestries. I've owned two of his tapestries that they have as well. I found one on the back of a church that was being pulled down, and I went to wash my hands, and I closed the door in the kitchen of this old Gothic Revival church, and hanging on the back was a William Morris curtain.
Being used as a hand towel. And they'd been cutting bits of it off. So it was shaped like a step, like that, where they'd been cutting bits to dry their hands or clean paintbrushes and things like that. Yeah. You have to remember, this stuff at one time was worth nothing. And there wasn't always a fever around it. I'm not very knowledgeable on the kind of development of the kind of collectability as such within and its importance from a kind of collecting perspective. When did that really begin, do you think?
It began, there was a huge layer. Remember, he was doing something, he was trying to stop what was going on. We all know about him trying to, his actions were against the constant sort of cast iron mass production being turned out. But he then also got back into mass production, but he brought it back 200 years. And he took a lot of his influences, as you all know, from the medieval periods, where you see a lot of the curtains from and the stained glass pieces from. But when it really started and people started to notice him was the 1980s.
Right.
Yes, there was collectors before.
Yeah.
There was collectors before. But you were still able, in the early 90s, to pick things up for nothing.
Wow.
Really, really cheap. Beautiful cheap things. And then if you knew a little bit more, you could find extraordinary things.
Yeah, what are there pieces out there that's like the holy grail of Morris that people are wanting to find or collect?
For me, it's always the next one. I've had 3 extraordinary Morris finds. One was when he designed the Sussex chair, or copied, or got his inspiration from the Sussex chair. He writes that on some of the early models, Rossetti was drawing lines on.
Who they met at Oxford, didn't they? Yeah.
So he was drawing little lines on the furniture. And I didn't give it any thought, but it lodged somewhere in my brain. And I'm going through a shipping container at an antique centre in Berkshire somewhere. Right at the back, there's one of these chairs, and I pull it out and I can see the lines on it. And I thought, this is a really early one.
And what date would that be?
This was just coming into the early 1880s.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And I just thought, this is an untouched thing. Master held this. This was maybe presented to him. Maybe they sat in a room looking at it going, I don't like the lines, I like the lines.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. But that's that thing where you just go, wow. And it does send a shiver down your spine. And then very recently I was filming near here. And we pulled up in the car outside this antique shop, and I just looked sideways, and the guy had a piece of stained glass in the window, and it's a piece of Morris stained glass. And it is that repeating oak leaf design, quarried section about so big, which I ended up buying, and I have it in my house now.
Okay. Yeah.
But the greatest find, I think, of all of them was on that day in 1986, when I took that stained glass out of that church. I then, at 23, so 7 years later, was made redundant by my wonderful boss, who no fault of his own. So I had to go self-employed, and I started off. My first set of books say classic car dealer, stained glass restorer, antique dealer. That was my first set of books. I think I turned over about £15,000 in a whole year. I was doing nothing really. And I get a phone call from an antique dealer. And he said, "Oh, Drew, you buy stained glass, don't you?" This was about a year into my business life. And I said, yeah. He said, "I've just got some from a house on Anglesey. I'll bring it over." So an hour goes by, and this ratty old LDV van turns up in my father's yard where I had my shed. And he opens the back doors, and it was the stained glass I took out in 1986.
Wow.
Untouched, in a big pile like this, in the back of the van, still with dirt on it, still with bits of cement stuck to the lead on the side, with cracks and breaks, with all the mistakes I'd made taking them out down the side. I would have been much more careful if I'd known. And I stood there, and my apprentice, I had an apprentice at this time, Darren, who was really into it, behind me, and he went, "Jesus," and I went, "Shut up." and he recognised it straight away, because there's a few things he did in his glass that you can always recognise. Yeah. And I said to Steve, "What do you want for this?" And he said, $5,000. Well, I had $3,000 to my name. I didn't really have all that, And I said, "Well, I'll give you 2,800 quid," and we settled on $3,000. We pulled this stuff out. I still hadn't lifted the first piece off. Yeah. And it was all the glass from the church, along with other contemporaries, so from Shrigley and Hunt and people like that. So all of the greats of the glass world were lying in the back of this van that I bought for $3,000.
And what's the restoration process like that? What do you start? Where do you start?
You start with now detailed photographs, but we used to start with a rubbing. So we'd literally get a piece of we used to use lining paper from wallpaper hanging. So we'd use that and had a great big block of chalk and you just rubbed it all over, so you had an accurate of what was there, with its imperfections as well, because sometimes the stone wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
So you'd have to get that imperfection in the leadwork back when you put it back together again. And you start with that. But these were largely untouched. And then I lifted the first piece off, and then I lifted the second piece off. And the third piece was what's called a quatrefoil. So it would have been above. So you have the two lancets like that of the windows. And then above them, there's a central piece that looks like a star, quattro. So it's got four points. And I could not believe my eyes. And it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And it was he did 3 of these, and it was a piece called Voyage to Vinland the Good. And it's a Viking ship crashing into the waves, and they're pulling back. All the Vikings are pulling back, and you can see the fear in their eyes. Right. And it's the most marvelous piece. It was only about that big. And I didn't, literally the hair standing. What hair I have is now standing up in the back of my neck. And I looked at this thing and I just knew it was special. I knew enough by then to know it was special. And I then took it home and I had it propped in my kitchen window.
Yeah.
And I kept looking at it all night. Had a glass of wine. I'm stood there looking at this thing. Going, God, it's remarkable.
What sort of colours are these pieces? I've seen
they're
some, but not...
Yeah, they're very bright.
Yeah, which is quite uncharacteristic for him from a colour palette perspective, isn't it? Because they were always very kind of chalky colourways, all of the wallpapers, weren't they? And kind of natural minerals. And...
Yeah, but also remember they've faded, whereas the glass didn't tend to. When he did his first sets of glass, particularly, he couldn't get the faces right. He couldn't get the firing process correct. So a lot of the very early glass, the faces are yellow because he hasn't got the silver stain correct.
Right.
So you can recognize very early Morris glass. And that's for the brief period he did it himself. Yeah. Because he didn't do it himself all the way through. He then had a team. Yeah. So he brought in a team that worked.
And these were done where?
I think they were at Kelmscott in the outbuildings.
Right, okay, yeah.
And so you can recognize that. And I have a section of one face still, which is a really early piece as well.
And the scale of them being...
Well, they could be everything from an east window. Yeah. So if you walk into a church, the window at the end, that is always the east window. Yeah. So he'd sometimes do full east windows, or sometimes he'd still just have one piece that he would do in. Remember, he was quite an avant-garde choice. You'd gone from all the staid Victorian, an angel, with a dragon, with a sword, to the glory of David Jones, local plasterer. It was all about the glorification of the man, not the god. Yeah. Not God. Where Morris sort of pulled that back. But he still had to have his benefactors who would commission the glass.
Yeah, I was going to say, who would be the big sort of people commissioning him for these pieces?
It would be wealthy families for deceased relatives, or it would be
and
councils.
Progressive thinkers, presumably.
Very much so. Yeah. It was a brave choice to pick up. You've had 50 to 70 years of mass production. Yeah. Right, have gone on. And then he's come and kicked back at it. Yeah. So it was a brave choice to go for that. And remember, he was it was a blip. He was a blip, but he resonated and still does, I think. Yeah.
And what about the kind of political context of choosing him?
Well, I didn't get into that for a long time, really. But then the whole socialist ideals that he had was something that interested me, but not a lot. Yeah. Being perfectly honest with you, I was more interested in his design process and looking at the beautiful objects. But also, he was a businessman.
Well, totally,
Not a very good businessman. It's like me. I'm a terrible businessman, but I know something when I look nice when I look at it. And the Sussex chair, saved them time and time again. Yeah. That's what paid the bills. He was always going off on weird tangents, But remember, he became, a specialist in tapestries, in books, in carving, wood carving, wallpaper. Yeah. It
Tiles
goes
so
on.
Much.
Yeah, he worked with all sorts, with plates, crockery, and his design work, everything. Yeah. It went across, but he also had a very, the early Morris stuff interests me like early Pugin. Yeah. It's utter purity of thought, total purity of thought, and that's rare. That's so rare.
And what do you think the enduring legacy is and the reason for its continuing popularity? What would that be?
For me, I think it feels accessible. Yeah. I think you can look at it and you don't have to be a great knowledgeable artist or art level or historian who've been taught anything. You can look at it and go, that's fantastic. Yeah. and anybody can do that. So it's immediately accessible and you can enjoy it straight away. And then if you want to, you can step further into it and learn more and read and go and look at things, and you can enjoy it. And it's still good. Not all Victoriana has worked.
No.
Has it really? I mean, they ruined a lot for me. They did.
I think it's interesting that, I think he did have the kind of mindset of making art into product.
Well, and he wanted everybody to have something beautiful.
Absolutely.
Have nothing in your houses that you do not know to be beautiful or you don't find to be useful. That really, on my first business card, I was so pompous. I put that on my first business card. What a prat. But I just thought, what a wonderful saying. He's nailed everything that I want in a sentence. And it worked.
Yeah.
And for me now, when I'm putting interiors together with people or collections or just finding things that I like to sell, his stuff does that, and it does it without shouting.
And when clients are looking for these pieces, are they definitely, what worlds are they looking for within Morris?
Sometimes it can be a house that's inspired by Morris or just a room.
Yeah.
Sometimes they want to, what I call, slow a room down. When the room is being a little bit too clever, you can put a piece of Morris furniture in there or some wallpaper or a tapestry or something, and it will just slow everything down and calm you down and make the room be less clever.
So my mugs are doing that for me.
Sorry?
My mugs are doing that for me.
And I think that's good. You can't take it too seriously, but here's an incredibly serious, as good as it gets design.
Yeah.
Right? That's instantly accessible and comfortable, and you feel you could put anything he made in your house, anything, and it will, it can work wherever you put it. And that there's very, very few things in the antique world that will do that.
And the collector obsessives, what are they looking for? I'm intrigued in the client aspect of this, because I think it's really fascinating that people have a shopping list of wannabe Morris items that they must have. I mean, you touched on it briefly, but
I always remember going into a guy's house, and I've bought and sold 55 stained glass windows by Morris.
And how many were there in total, do you think?
There are hundreds, and there's 2 books called The Stained Glass of William Morris and His Circle. And they're 2 very, very thick books. They're about this thick each. And even the book's rare. I paid £400 for the pair of books 20-odd years ago.
Right, okay.
And I've since found, it's not definitive, though.
Yeah.
And I've found 2 pieces that aren't in the book. But the collectors of them tend to be, either got in on the act early, when nobody really realised, it wasn't so collectible.
Yeah.
Or extremely wealthy and know exactly what they want. I've got an American client, he's younger than me, not young anymore, living in London, and for the last 29 years I've been selling him things. Okay. And the first time I went to his flat, I walked in and he had a pile this high in the corner of Morris fabrics just folded up on the floor. And I don't know if any of you have heard of some potters called the Martin brothers. Anybody? And the Martin brothers were these incredible, beardy, weirdy potters, right? Who made the most, those, ever remember the big cigar jars they made that looked like a ho-ho bird?
Yeah.
Remember one being very famously found on the Antiques Roadshow. It's worth £20,000, right? I walked into this guy, and all along his kitchen there was just a row, just going all the way around. And he just said to me, whatever you get that's Morris, Eugene, Martin brothers, I want it, and I want the earliest, and I want the biggest, and I want the best. But he really understood it, and he loved them.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's lots of people. I don't think I've ever had a time when I haven't got something by Morris in my house. My house is just a sort of an ongoing. Well, I think there'd be an intervention if somebody came around. To be honest with you, there's too much stuff in there. But I've always got something by him in there.
And what about the wallpapers?
The wallpapers, I've only ever...
Do you find rolls and or sheets or however they'd be from those early periods?
I wish.
That would be a find.
No, I've never found anything like that. I think I've had nearly all of the chairs now.
Yeah.
Nearly all of the chairs that were retailed. And as I said, over 55 windows I bought and sold, and the last one I bought, I've got to keep. Because now they're getting extremely hard to find. To find one in the wild.
Is wild.
Is unheard of. And it was a lot of money, it wasn't cheap.
Yeah.
In fact, it's going to be on TV soon. you'll see how much I paid for it.
Right.
And it needs full restoration as well, which I say I'm going to do it. If I get time, I will do it.
Yeah. It's kind of, I find that the whole wallpaper conversation really fascinating, because I wasn't aware until recently that his father, if I'm correct, had shares in a Devon mine that actually was one of the largest arsenic mines.
Was it really?
In the country.
There you go. There's a Morris fact.
Contrary to his ethos of having kind of very safe materials on the whole, he was knowingly printing with arsenic.
Well, and a lot of, still today, a lot of the traditional stained glass methods, they're highly toxic.
Yeah.
They really are toxic. But his method, sort of, we'd call it a 10-footer. So if you get up close to some of his glass particularly, it's quite rough. It's not fine.
Right, yeah.
But from 10 foot away, it starts to make sense.
And are there drawings for the kind of practice drawings as such for these, the kets and what have you?
They're called cartoons. I don't know if you use the same things. Yeah. And the cartoons are the black and white drawings you'll see of the full length, and the lead would be picked out as black lines. So there will be some of those. I've owned one of those and a couple of preliminary sketches as well, which I would give my back teeth for now.
Yeah.
And, I was broke and I was a young dad and I had to pay the bills, so they had to come and go. But I would recognise these things and the importance of them, and I'd sell, I think the last one I sold was £1,200. One of those a long time ago, and now I'd probably put a couple of zeros on the end of it there.
Yeah.
Extremely valuable.
Extraordinary. And what else should we chat about within the world of Morris?
Morris, I think it's the legacy now, and I think that he still remained relevant.
Yeah.
And I think he's still easily accessible. It's almost like a sort of gateway drug into the antique world.
Yeah.
You can sort of come in there and enjoy a little bit of it, but almost no money. You can just buy a poster, or you can buy a postcard or a mug, or it doesn't matter. Because he always had to pay the bills. He was constantly trying to find the next thing that paid for the next adventure, be it glass or Kelmscott Press, whatever. Yeah. He was always trying to find money for that next thing. And also, it is out there. We were talking on the way here that my world is like being in a field that gets ploughed every now and again, and a bit pops up. And I just have to be the guy that goes, hang on, I'll have that. And that's all it is.
Yeah, you've got the luck and eye for it. No, I've never really been able to find any so far.
But that's all I do.
Yeah,
that's all. I don't do anything else. Yeah. So we were going to use my car to come over here, but we couldn't because I've got chairs in the back of it. That's true, isn't it? We couldn't get over here because I was out till late last night buying chairs and lamps. Yeah. But it's also his place in the roster of time. So from the 19th century through to now, the influence and his piece of it, and then you've got little offshoots like the aesthetic movement, which I find incredibly interesting. One of my favourite things. But would we have had the aesthetic movement without that?
Did he do anything in metalwork as such?
Yes, he worked with John Hardman and company and did huge amounts in Birmingham.
Right.
He made a lot of stained glass windows.
Yeah.
He worked with Pugin, but he would work with them as well, and he would make door handles and door furniture, window latches. He'd design window frames. It went all the way through. He wasn't as prolific as Pugin, where Pugin would design anything, every last nut and bolt. But Morris was a bit loose. I always feel like he's a bit of a hippie.
Yeah. Like you don't get the sense of like kind of very, kind of like from an archival perspective that he was collecting that in a very methodical manner. Were records kept of everything that was made and when and where and materials? Of kind of
not that I've seen. I haven't seen any of those.
I've seen some of the pamphlets that the kind of sales books.
Yeah, well, you'll see the press pamphlets. Yeah, well. You'll see a lot of that comes out, particularly with sort of his socialist speeches as well. Yeah. That were put through his press. But examples of, I've got a friend of mine, Simon, who's a book dealer over in Norfolk, and he's had quite a lot of his stuff as well. But because I'm focused on the sort of the decorative arts side of things and the furniture, that's what I'm looking for. But if it came past my door, I'd happily buy it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Any questions of thoughts of Morris worlds that are flying around, or thoughts or conversations to start with?
Did any of that make sense to anybody? Was that all right? There you go.
You talked about some of the toxic materials he used, but how do you handle that when you're restoring pieces?
in 1986 on the YTS, badly. I was told when we were doing acid etching, believe it or not, I was told to put my hand over my mouth while I was doing acid etching on glass.
That explains a lot, Drew.
It does explain a lot. I think I went bald because all my front hair fell out because I was covered in lead. And I won't tell you exactly what they said to me. I had a 2-minute lesson on lead, which they said, if you're handling lead, imagine you've got dog on your hands.
Right, okay.
Treat it like that. So never put your hands towards your mouth and your head.
Yeah.
But after a couple of years, you're like, brushing your hair. You're eating your sandwiches and you're not eating the bit you're holding and things like that. And I eventually got quite bad lead poisoning. That's why I stopped being a restorer, because I got very, very, very high lead levels in my stream. So yeah, I got to, well, something odd happened a long time ago. Somebody asked me my name and I forgot my name.
Crumbs.
and went to the doctor because I thought, oh my God, what's this? And then they did all the tests and they said, your lead level is massive. What do you do for a living?
Yeah.
So no, it wasn't handled very well. Health and safety wasn't handled very well. Back then, maybe because of the ventilation in the older buildings, I'd like to think it was handled better than this, but I really, really don't know. But in North Wales in 1986, health and safety was not a factor at all. So any other questions about Morris or antiques or anything? There you go, somebody at the back there.
How much of what he did do you think he designed himself rather than it being collaborative? Because he had a number of people around him, didn't he, who were all very artistic. And talking about stained glass, there was Burne-Jones as well at the time, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Did they sort of interact, and did he also make things that other people had designed?
As far as I know, no. His interaction with Burne-Jones was the most work I've seen by Morris with somebody else is Burne-Jones with glass. Nearly all of it was a collaboration. Nearly every piece that they produced.
And who doing what in the relationship?
It was both design.
Okay.
Both design, both mixing design. But I do think that Morris would be handling the backgrounds and the quarries and the overall feel and colour. And I think Burne-Jones would have been handling the figurative element of it. I think the people.
Yeah.
I think that's what they'd have done.
That could make sense.
Yeah. And then when they were produced, when glass was produced, when they were producing it, and it hasn't changed now, they would have their best painter. And their best painter would do the hands and faces. And then the secondary painter would do the cloth. And then the junior would do the quarries at the background. So the repeating leaves. And Morris used to do this thing where the inner borders of the glass, there'd be a little tiny inner border. And he'd used flashed glass, so a ruby red or a blue glass that has clear glass with coloured glass flashed at very high temperature across the surface. And they would etch out a sort of like a snaky pattern all the way down with an interspersed dot. And that's one of the ways you can recognise his work. It's been copied, but the earlier work particularly, you can see that.
As his own hand.
As his own hand, yeah. So you can tell Morris's own hand because he was always the first to try something.
Right.
He was always the first guy, with the press particularly, he was the first guy to sort of just physically get there and start making the blocks and cuttings. So that's where the interest, the first of anything is always the interest.
You can actually see the hand very recognisably.
It's one of those rare things in life where there's a design genius and you can touch something that he's touched, and that still excites me. Whenever I have handled something by, say, Pugin, who's just a genius. Again, I think there's been a few of them, but he's one of them. There's a magic to it.
Yeah.
And it comes back to that purity of thought and that purity of design, where that was their focus. We've embellished the whole thing as arts and crafts, which is a very nice way of sort of putting it all together, but it's more than that. How
do you think he would have embraced technology? From a creative perspective?
I think he'd have thrown it out the window. I think that went very far away.
Yeah.
He was all about getting back to simple methods, straightforward methods. And if you're making something on a daily basis, what I particularly love in the antiques world is if I find anything that you can see, a chair or a table or a light or something, or a vase that's been made by somebody. So at 12 years old, they were put into a factory or a workshop and they're producing something. And then 30 years later, they're still producing that thing, but there's nuances to it. And there's an art, and that's where the art comes in.
Yeah.
And they probably don't realise that the magic,
isn't it?
And certain things have that magic. And that, for me, I've slightly lost my track here, but when you see that thing and you learn to recognise that, the whole world opens up. And for me, Morris did that.
Yeah.
Because I was sort of blinkered and I wanted to know about things but didn't know how. And then as soon as I'd learned about Morris, you learn about the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing.
It's that accessibility again, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's really very welcoming.
It's reading a book is probably about the best thing you can possibly. I'm just realised I'm at a literary festival, aren't we? But it's reading a book for me. I went through school. I learned nothing. I learned skiving off and buying and selling dinner tickets and Dr. Martens. That's what I learned. And reading a book for me opened up my very empty head of thing. I had nothing in there, and it just sticks. And then if you keep on reading and keep on looking and keep on handling things by the greats, the world suddenly becomes a much, much bigger place. And you can walk into a city and read a building and read a church interior and read an antique. You can look at things and understand how it was made and why it was made. And what Morris did with that was almost overlay everything he made with the honesty of how it was produced on top. And that's exactly what he was after. And it's exactly what he did.
Yeah.
Brilliantly simple.
Wonderful.
I feel like I've gone on too much now. Hello, one here.
Yeah, I just wondered, did his wife ever design?
Jane.
Yeah.
As far as I know, yes.
Yes, she did.
Yeah.
She worked with him on quite a number of the tapestries, I think, didn't she? And on some of the wallpapers.
Yeah. Yeah. But as ever, they weren't pushed to the back, but there was 18th and 19th century ladies working in the arts world were still very much on the back foot,
There's some quite good documentation in Walthamstow, photographically, of the teams who worked on pieces that you can get. You can find them online.
There's photographs of the workshops, isn't there?
Yeah. And with the actual piece, with teams of, I think they generally worked between teams of like 4 and 6, I suppose, with different techniques, especially with the tapestries, who would be working on what aspect of it. A bit like the stained glass, as you said.
Yes, there would have been a team. Every man would have had his job. So there would be one man who did the cartoons, one man who did the lead cutting, one man who did the glass cutting. One guy did the glass choice, but that came down to Morris. But the female factor in the antiques world it's there. There's I don't know if any of you have heard of Code stone, made by a lady called Eleanor Code in the 18th century. Came up with still the best terracotta procedure there's ever been, and her stuff is incredibly highly prized. And she was a Georgian businesswoman, and she left 80% of her wealth for girls' schools to be built in the 18th century, and 20% for boys to be taught. She was really a real leader in this. So I think Jane's place in the Morris sort of needs to be investigated more.
All right,
I'd like to know.
Yeah, thanks.
Hello, both of you. I just wondered, Drew, with your background in restoration of stained glass, etc., have you designed any windows or anything that somebody's going to be collecting in hundreds of years from now yourself?
Unlikely. I was an enthusiastic amateur, I think it's probably. Well, no, I was a professional in it. I did 2 church commissions, so they're the ones that really, really last. But strangely...
Where can we see these, please?
Sorry?
Where can we see these?
They're in a church in Denbigh in North Wales, and there's 2 of them in there that we designed. And honestly, I look at them now and cringe. I think I could have done so much. I think I could have done so much better. But recently, I don't know if anybody saw a program I'd done recently with Johnny Vegas. I don't know if anybody saw that one. Did you see the piece of stained glass by me we found in an antique shop being sold as a Victorian original? I was like, excuse me. That is not. I made that in Glanconway in 1994. So no, that definitely isn't. But it's with I don't know, particularly if you copy something, and it's the best way to learn, and you get better by copying. What was that saying about artists? What is it? Good artists copy and great artists steal. And I think if you just, for me, drawing things out by him and understanding for that brief second being in his head, that was one of those light bulb moments.
Yeah, he had the most extraordinary hand, I think. The kind of the rhythm and the fluidity of the paintwork is just extraordinary, which you could then translate into the woodcuts is, it's a huge skill to be able to do that. Incredibly time consuming.
Yeah.
Also.
I mean, I've been going on for ages. We need to talk about the other side, where it comes into the fashion side of things with you.
Yeah,
Does it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as I discussed earlier, just from an inspiration perspective, it's elements of the ethos of the whole world that really kind of got me hooked, and that way in which that you can develop your world from an illustrative perspective, drawing textile designs, getting those produced, prints, all of that aspect from like a one-man shop, so to speak, was something that really, really excited me. It still does. Yeah. And it was his, kind of ethos of that very much got me into the world of where I am now.
We've spoken about, because we spoke to each other before we came here, was it last week or the week before, about we're not scholars of man. If you say, right, in April the 12th, 1875, what was he doing? What did he have for lunch? We don't know that. All we can say to you is that the effect it's had on you and I, separately in our businesses, and is massive, and it's ongoing, and I do hope that it continues to be for everybody that sees it and touches it and is touched by frankly, I'm going to use the word again, genius of it, the simplistic genius of just working really, really hard.
Yeah,
a real grafter, and if you work really hard at something, eventually you're going to get there. But he also had something else.
Yeah, that idiosyncrasy with everything, I think, is so fascinating to me.
Yeah. So but scholars we are not, but I think enthusiasts of him for sure. And I think everything I get by Morris in the future, I'll be keeping.
Yes, that's a good plan.
That's for sure. And I have a real
getting a piece.
Yeah, I have a real. I'll find you some. I'll sell you some. It has. I have a real problem keeping things. I really struggle to keep hold of things. If it stays in my house for more than a week, it's staying for good generally. So yeah.
Does everyone know about St Martin on the Hill in Scarborough?
I don't.
There's William Morris stained windows. You can have a personal tour all the way around the church.
I will do that next time I'm in Scarborough.
St Martin on the Hill in Scarborough, and it has a tea room.
Oh, well. I'm in. T and I, we always say,
Scarbados, here we come.
Yeah, Scarbados. Anywhere that's got a tea room and sells cakes, I'm in. Seriously.
Thanks for the top tip there.
Yeah, definitely. But they were so prolific with their work. They didn't just produce 6 or 7. They produced hundreds, if not thousands of pieces that are still out there. And you can wonder, in Llandudno, there's 3 churches that have still got, and they've all got independent pieces. They all commissioned pieces by him.
Wow.
And then in the next town, Diganway to Llandudno, there's another one. And then down in Bethsacoed, I remember going to Bethsacoed Church, and I walked in to value some pieces in the church, and I went, "Oh, nice Morris window," and they went, "What?" I said, "Well, your east window, it's by William Morris." "Is it?" And a very rapid revaluation for insurance was done. Extremely rapid,
I'm sure.
Yeah. But it's everywhere, and it's and I like to think he's still having an effect. Is he still having an effect?
Absolutely is. Yeah, 100% he is.
Yeah. I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so. Well, you're all obviously keen, on the man himself. So, and there's so many. I think if you can see something in that, you can see something in Pugin, and then the much maligned, I think, and ruined Rennie Mackintosh. I think was another one of absolute clarity of thought, genius. I actually bought a piece by him once, and it cost a fortune, and I didn't really have the money for it. I remember not eating. I bought a bench by Mackintosh, and I remember not having enough money to eat. Just one night, but that was that one night. But I had this piece.
And then you sold it.
Yeah, of course.
Under a week.
Yeah. And Rennie Mackintosh has been, I call it, he's been ruined by the car sticker. The little stained glass car sticker of the tea room glass. He's been ruined by that. But I think there's Morris, and I'd love to have sat them down all in a room together and chatted, with Pugin and Morris and Mackintosh. And all of these guys, it was that, again, it just comes back down to total purity of thought and drive and a genius mind. There's something in there, and that's what I'm always looking for. in praise of all these geniuses that are around me, which I'm able to handle their things occasionally.
So I truly adore his work, and it's interesting you saying, going back to the sex and drugs aspect, is that I've often thought, I wonder how much fun he was, because I don't know whether he's really was that much fun.
Well, I don't know. I did an interview recently for...
Seems terribly serious.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't. I don't think they were all the time.
They can't be, but it's...
No, and I did an interview recently, and one of the questions was, who would be your perfect dinner party guests? And I said, John Lydon from the Sex Pistols, my grandmother, William Morris, and PJ Harvey. And I think that would be, for me, I just want to throw all those people together and see what happens. And I think they would have been great fun. Yeah, definitely.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're wrapping up nearly here, aren't we, Alison? So thank you very much for coming and listening to us chatter away about the wonderful Mr. William Morris.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.